A Link Between Worlds is one of the strangest Zelda games thus far. And no, these still don't count, for all the smartasses in the comments. This game is as much a sequel as it is a remake, and that's already a pretty damn odd concession. In order to better understand why it is this way though, we'll have to delve into a bit of its surprisingly turbulent history. I promise this won't be too long, I know these can be a little boring. After the release of Spirit Tracks, most of that team was transferred to work on the newest Zelda project, which at the time was Skyward Sword. 3 of the remaining members set to work on an entirely different Zelda for the soon-to-be-released 3DS. Using Spirit Tracks' framework and 6 months of planning, they presented it to Miyamoto under the core theme of communication, which he dubbed too outdated. It was at this point that the team thought up a new idea, allowing Link to merge with his environment to solve puzzles and traverse the world. Miyamoto accepted the prototype for this idea, but soon after, the entire team was set to work on Wii U launch titles, which meant that development ceased entirely. After Skyward Sword, Aonuma revisited this abandoned idea, and gathered a team to make a game out of it. They presented several concepts to Miyamoto, which he swiftly declined. However, he brought up the possibility of using this new mechanic to remake A Link to the Past. See, the 3D effect of the 3DS was, at the time, best marketed through remakes. Ocarina of Time 3D and Star Fox 64 3D only really exist because of this. So, the idea of remaking A Link to the Past on the 3DS wasn't too out there an idea, but that original mechanic still remained. What we got was an original game, a sequel, and a remake. It's really weird, though the results are strangely reassuring. This is The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. Link, now an apprentice blacksmith, sets off to deliver a forgotten sword to the captain of the guard. Through a series of unfortunate events, a sorcerer named Yuga casts a spell on the priest's daughter that turns her into a painting. After Link fails to stop the sorcerer, he meets Ravio, who hands him a bracelet, sends him off to Hyrule Castle to warn Zelda of the coming threat, and you go on a MacGuffin hunt similar to the one in the original. 3 items, Master Sword, Hyrule Castle Dungeon, 7 sages in Lorule, a fight with Yuga and Ganon, the end. What initially seems like a similar structure is quickly differentiated by A Link Between Worlds' open progression. Those 3 initial MacGuffins can be sought after in any order the player chooses, and even more interestingly, the 7 sages can be saved in any order the player chooses. Necessary items can be rented from Ravio, and you lose those rented items whenever you die. You can later purchase those items to keep them permanently for a higher fee, but either way, you are not locked out of any potential progression paths. Both Hyrule and Lorule are yours to explore. This is perhaps the reason why this game is so beloved, and at the time it was a fairly radical shift for the franchise. You have to remember that this was before Breath of the Wild, when the hottest new Zelda game was Skyward Sword. This was a pretty damn radical change. With such a radical change came a host of new issues to consider. How do you properly flesh out a story on a canvas with so many colors? How do you efficiently balance dungeons that have no preset order? How do you balance difficulty in such an open game? If you'll recall, one of the reasons Zelda moved away from a more open structure was to avoid these very questions. It was simply a lot easier to tell a conventional narrative and maintain a steady difficulty curve when the player was on a straight track, which is why Zelda came to be defined by its linearity over the years. However, that never quite eliminated the core conceit of the original, and it was inevitable that these questions would be tackled head-on using more powerful hardware and years of development expertise. You're told a narrative in set chunks and at set intervals, meaning you won't miss out on anything important. After saving a few sages of any kind, Hilda, Lorule's Zelda equivalent, will drop a few hints about the fate of their kingdom. Each sage is also plot relevant, so their areas are a bit more memorable. The blacksmith's son, Gully, goes missing early on. It turns out that because he was a descendant of one of the sages, Yuga turned him into a painting and stuck him in the Dark Palace. It's a small touch, but it already makes for a more interesting story when you save him. His character is clearly a reference to the flute boy that goes missing in A Link to the Past, except this time he has direct story relevance and a more involved link to the player. He's even the first character you see in the game, waking you up after you've clearly overslept. Sometimes it's just done as a gag. Irene, your fast travel system, turns out to be one of the sages. When she's absent, the broom will follow you without a rider and take you where you need to go. Neat touch. I mean, these aren't exactly grade A Zelda characters, but looking at a picture of them standing next to each other, they seem far more inspired than the random maidens in A Link to the Past, and your interactions with them after each dungeon are reminiscent of Ocarina of Time. This structure ensures that something interesting will happen no matter where you decide to go. Rosso goes missing, so you have to brave his mind to find him. Queen Auron is gone, the Zoras freak out, and they ask you to save her. Again, nothing groundbreaking, but I like how the world changes over time and that your choices as a player don't ultimately affect the quality of the storytelling. I suppose it's harder to tell a linear set of events, so a lot of the main plot is sparse until the middle and end of the game, but this is also a Zelda story on a much smaller scale, and that ending twist is enough to shoot it past anything A Link to the Past was trying to do. There's a hell of a lot to take in here. Yuga, clearly a stand-in for Aghanim from the original, was working under the orders of Hilda. Lorule's Triforce was destroyed long ago in order to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands, but that also had a ripple effect that left the entire kingdom unprotected. Hyrule only ever sealed its Triforce, which meant that the legendary hero could use its power when necessary. Lorule had lost that luxury, and so it fell to ruin. Seeing this twisted, more desperate reflection of Zelda is fascinating. One who has been driven to such dark depths that would see her stealing the Triforce from another world. It's a little scary to think that Zelda could have ended up like this if the same fate were to befall Hyrule. Of course, Link is there to snap her out of it. Finding out that Ravio was this dimension's equivalent of Link, that he failed in his mission, is one of those twists that is almost impossible to see coming. I'm sure some of you out there called it, I'm not doubting anyone. It's just so well masked, even though in retrospect it seems really obvious. It strengthens a second playthrough since you can comb through Ravio's dialogue for hints. It's also just really cool that your biggest helper is actually a different, dejected version of you attempting to avert a second tragedy, and it further bolsters the parallels between the two dimensions. One of my favorite elements of the original was the light versus dark world traversal, and how it made you rethink previous areas. For as much as it added, though, the two worlds did feel a little too disconnected for their own good, and the crossover that did exist was very slight. Lorule is a more literal depiction of what would happen if the world fell to ruin. Some of the same cheery characters in Hyrule are dreary and cynical in Lorule, and it's hard not to blame them. I think the direct parallels between specific characters is what sells me on the idea the most. It retains that wonderful feeling of traveling to Lorule and seeing the direct contrast, while also littering it with subtle links to connect them. Previously hospitable characters like the blacksmith and his wife are now cruel and unwelcoming. Hilda is a bit of a brooder, a stark contrast to the playful and naive Zelda. The captain is now a bitter drunk, well, as drunk as you can get in a milk bar, ranting about the pitiful state of his kingdom. The masked elder, Sahasrah's Lorule equivalent, is the leader of a cult who put masks on to escape the corruption. Lorule is bleak and oppressive, which sets it apart from the more overt terror of the Dark World. The best part about it, though, is that come the end of the game, Lorule might now have a Triforce, but it's not like it's cured of everything wrong with it. These people are going to have to repair their very deep wounds over time. They were forced into some very dark and defeating places, and climbing out of it won't be simple. All you did was give them the tools to climb out of that depression, a chance to start over, even if it's going to take a lot of work. Which feels like a disturbingly appropriate message for our very damaged world. Exploring Hyrule and Lorule is done at set points throughout the world, like the original, except now there are a lot more travel points and each area is broken up into distinct sections. You still have to find the right portals like the original, but it's even more segmented. That's fine though, because a lot of your exploration will simply be done in Hyrule. You'll often be trying to find a way to a new section of Lorule, one you otherwise can't access due to gaping holes in the ground or giant mountains. It's yet another thing A Link to the Past also did. This is why it's hard for me to call this a straight-up sequel and be done with it, because it feels eerily similar to the original in every way, despite the story clearly taking place after the original. It has incredibly similar dungeon and overworld design, but with subtle, sometimes obvious changes to set it apart. You've still got a town of thieves, a dark palace, a big tower, a water palace, Turtle Rock, the usual. But now there's a desert temple for some reason. You've got the returning bow, hookshot, boomerang, hammer, fire rod, ice rod, and all of them with basically the same use case as before. But you've also got an entirely new set of items, like the sand rod and tornado rod, just for fun. Additionally, the layout of each dungeon is completely different, except for a few callbacks here and there. But see, these differences start to resemble straight-up improvements the further you look. Each of the dungeon items can be permanently upgraded once owned, provided you've saved enough of the Mai-Mais throughout both Hyrule and Lorule. A Link Between Worlds has an upgrade for every single major dungeon item, one that makes it more effective in combat. Now you have to upgrade the hookshot into the longshot. Well, it's actually called the nice hookshot, but you get what I mean. It'll have an extended range while also being able to damage enemies instead of only stunning them. The nice bow allows you to shoot 3 arrows at once in a shotgun spread. The nice bombs are twice as large and twice as powerful. The nice hammer hits a larger area and does more damage. These upgrades change how you approach combat in a pretty substantial way. 10 Mai-Mais will get you an upgrade, so the pace at which you get rewards is never too slow. This is on top of returning sword and shield upgrades. Also, since you can choose which items you want and when, you have more control over your combat repertoire than ever before. You can rent the hookshot for reliable stuns instead of the boomerang if you want, or you can go for the bow and hammer early for powerful ranged and melee options. Hell, if you're a madman, you can even rent out his entire arsenal, which is a bit of a rupee drain, but nothing you can't ultimately handle. However, a single death will see all of those items removed, forcing you to rent them again from Ravio. It's a wonderful way to encourage players to carry a more limited arsenal, and you never have to worry about running out of resources in a dungeon and getting stuck, since every single item is tied to the same stamina bar. It retains the pros of magic in Zelda games, which is meant to limit your item usage, but eliminates the need to keep refilling the bar in often annoying ways. Being overpowered has been turned into a risk-reward mechanic, which is almost always a good thing in my book. Thus, exploration feels consistently gratifying. Your rupees feed back into the rental mechanic, meaning that they'll always be useful for a majority of your playthrough, depending on your skill level, so it's almost always worth it to just fumble about the world and see what's around the corner. Pretty much everything is worth doing in this game. Avoiding cuckoos, racing across Hyrule with the Pegasus boots, boss and enemy gauntlets, rupee rushes. Okay, maybe the baseball minigame sucks, but oh well. We always gotta have one dud in there, It's some kind of universal law. Unfortunately, that incentive to explore is diminished a bit by the game's relative lack of difficulty, especially compared to A Link to the Past. A Link Between Worlds is fairly forgiving overall, which means that death is a rarer occurrence. It still happened to me, but not nearly enough to prevent me from renting out Ravio's entire shop all the time. You just take much less damage overall, and paired with a less limited sense of movement, you can coast through the main adventure without a care in the world. Bosses and enemies don't scale with you, they just get harder with each story checkpoint. In the beginning, they're pretty easy, and then they get a little harder once you reach Lorule, and then they get harder once you're at the final dungeon. This means that dungeon difficulty is more or less the same for most of your playthrough. Maybe you'll struggle with your first or second Lorule dungeon, but beyond that you'll already have so many heart containers that progress will be no problem at all. I feel like this could have been remedied by a more adaptive scaling system, though I'm not sure how much work it would have taken to implement, or if it would have even been possible. Skyrim fixed Oblivion scaling issues, so hey, it was definitely possible at the time on consoles at least. I guess the game does technically scale, but only at specific choke points. The final dungeon is obviously going to be harder than the rest because you're forced into it last. It just means that for whichever of the 7 dungeons you choose to tackle near the end, you'll probably carry on without a care in the world. Thankfully, hero mode is an option here, where enemies do 4 times more damage. Hearts do still appear, and paired with the ability to collect a ton of bottles with potions and fairies, late game can still feel a little too easy for my liking. It largely fulfills its purpose and makes Ravio a more risky mechanic, even if it isn't as effective as future hero modes would eventually be. I'm not extremely bothered by its difficulty though, because unlike A Link to the Past, the dungeons focus more on puzzle solving and traversal. I wouldn't consider any of them a personal favorite, but the fact that they're also consistently solid is pretty rare for this series. The Tower of Hera makes good use of the hammer to play with multiple floors, and utilizes the wall merging mechanic to explore both the inside and outside of the tower. One cool thing about the 2.5D perspective is that you get much more depth than you did in A Link to the Past. Where bottomless pits in that game were solid colors with death boxes, A Link Between Worlds makes it feel like you're constantly looking over a cliff. As someone who's afraid of heights, I cringe a little whenever you're exploring the outside of a dungeon. They do make for some beautiful landscapes though. The ice ruins look incredible, and exploring their outskirts is a lot more interesting than simply being in a dank, square cave. The ice ruins are probably my favorite dungeon in this game. There are some tricky traversal puzzles on the outskirts, some moments where you have to play with the perspective to light torches above you, and multiple floor traversal that makes you consider all of the dungeon at once. It's nothing extraordinary, but all I really need is 1 or 2 moments where I'm a bit lost and I'll be satisfied. I think it's worse to have a bunch of dungeons that don't test you in any satisfying way, rather than a full, solid set of dungeons that at least felt thought-provoking in some way. My prime example of this game's dungeon design is the Swamp Palace. When compared to other water dungeons, there isn't nearly as much going on. Previous games forced you to think about how the water level would affect every single room in the dungeon, meaning that it was easy to get lost at every turn. Swamp Palace isn't really like that. You do have to notice what changing the water level will do to the dungeon as a whole, but there aren't nearly as many rooms or floors, and they're all bunched together in a way that makes it a lot more straightforward to figure out. However, I also wouldn't call it an easy dungeon, since I did still have to think about where I needed the water level to be and where I had to end up at various points. It's certainly more interesting to me than the Swamp Palace in A Link to the Past, where changing the water level was used mostly to progress, rather than as a puzzle-solving tool. I enjoy that A Link Between Worlds has a set of dungeons with mechanical personality, and that don't merely focus on sending waves of enemies at you. That shit got a little silly near the end of A Link to the Past. Lorule Castle still has a lot more enemies than usual, it is the final dungeon, but it isn't just a never-ending gauntlet of them. You have to solve a lot of room puzzles along the way. Lorule Castle is interesting because it feels like a culmination of every kind of puzzle, enemy, or boss you've completed up to this point. You push statues, navigate dark labyrinths, trick floor masters into breaking walls, hookshot onto a raft to sail around pools of lava, sometimes all of the above at once. It's a really solid final dungeon. The dungeon bosses also feel thematically relevant. Desert Palace is centered around the Sand Rod, where you create bridges to navigate higher floors. Since you have to merge with the pillars you create, there always has to be a safe place for Link to drop off at, and the rod can only create pillars in a straight line, leading to tricky puzzles. Its boss has you doing that exact same thing, creating pillars to wall merge your way past holes in the ground and play a game of whack-a-mole. It's easy to accuse dungeon bosses like this of being too simple, since you've already been using the dungeon item you need to beat them. It's not exactly a mystery what you need to use. I understand why that can feel underwhelming, but I think it really only applies when the actual boss isn't fun to fight on its own. Like, sure, the way to beat Darkstare is to throw fire at him, but he's also encasing you in weird triangles that you have to dodge on slippery terrain. Even though you kinda already know how to beat him, it's still hard to reach that point, and he gets more aggressive as the fight goes on. The Gemasaur King is weak to bombs and you need to light torches. That much is fairly obvious. But when he turns the room pitch black and starts sprinting around everywhere, yeah, it does feel like a pretty intense fight. In this way, I feel like A Link Between Worlds maintains the intensity of the boss fights in A Link to the Past, while also managing to make them fit in with the dungeons they're at the end of. After all, the final bosses usually fill the traditional boss role fairly well. Yuga Ganon is a straight-up duel, reminiscent of the Ganon fight in A Link to the Past, where you have to avoid his trident throws and magic. Though there's a unique twist with the wall merging mechanic, where you need to shoot him in the back through the cylinder, and I always thought that was a clever use of the gimmick. I guess it's worth discussing the crux of this game's progression in more detail, considering it was such a huge deal at the time. After a series had so thoroughly explored the realm of linearity and tightly focused narratives, returning to the style of the original Zelda was pretty refreshing. Past Zelda games, of course, had their elements of exploration through side content like heart pieces and upgrades, but the main stories were rarely, if ever, deviant. A lot of your exploration would be done outside the context of the main story. In A Link Between Worlds, you are essentially asked to explore everything at once, with virtually zero roadblocks. This can affect both a first playthrough and a repeat playthrough differently. On your first playthrough, the main progression is less a question of where you have to go, and more a question of where you want to go. It's a tight balance, since you have to make everything in the world worth doing for that exploration to feel gratifying on such a small screen. I think Breath of the Wild gets away with a lot of filler content due to the size and scope of its world. There is so much wonder packed into every crevice, and you'll be spending such an insane amount of time in it that stumbling across a dud here and there won't register as strongly in your mind as it would in A Link Between Worlds, where the size of the world is comparable to other Zelda releases. Oddly enough, I think the wall merging mechanic is a genius way to get more mileage out of the world. This is a mechanic that feels distinct from other Zelda items. They usually feel like a key for a world lock, where you simply fire an arrow or light a torch to open the way to a secret. Wall merging, though, often asks you to consider every single interactable wall and where it might lead. There are secrets hidden atop ledges, or mice stuck where the camera wouldn't usually illuminate, and clever wall merging is the secret to them all. Since you can technically have every tool at your disposal using Ravio, it loses that feeling of a Metroidvania that past titles championed, and instead is more about charting your path and remembering points of interest, which you can mark on your map if you like. It's a more fundamental shift than you might initially imagine, since it makes the player feel more like they're exploring uncharted territory rather than hunting for a series of locks that you might be able to exploit later. Neither approach is inherently better than the other, but I believe the approach of something like A Link Between Worlds fits an open-air progression much better. Again, Breath of the Wild would also give the players all of the necessary tools to explore the world as they saw fit. However, that game also had a sense of difficulty and adaptive scaling on its side to create areas that players might save for later, like a coliseum with a particularly difficult Lynel, or a camp full of high-level enemies. A Link Between Worlds, disregarding the fact that it's a pretty easy game on the surface, is still built to be like a Zelda of old, so although there are some tough puzzles here and there, about the only time you'll be ignoring a challenge is when you don't have the correct item from Ravio. Enemies are pretty rudimentary, and since they scale with your story progress, you'll be running up against a pretty consistent level of difficulty no matter where you explore. When you do revisit the game, though, it becomes a whole different beast, since you're allowed to tackle each dungeon in an order that makes sense to you. You can plan out what items to rent for which stretches of game time, since you'll have that information to work with. You can decide which dungeons you want to tackle first. Do you want to get the risky ones out of the way, or do you want to stockpile a ton of items and play it safe in the dungeons you know best? I know it sounds kinda silly, but even just the ability to pick whichever dungeons you want to visit first, as someone coming back to play this game again for the first time in several years, it felt like such a fresh experience. Since that initial playthrough was unpredictable, so was a revisit later down the line where I carved out an entirely new path through the world. In fact, since the scaling isn't super in-depth, it potentially means that you can make your own difficulty by picking dungeons that might have been easier to brute force with more heart containers and do them first on another playthrough. I would still like to see a more thorough scaling system for future games of this type, but it's perhaps an underappreciated byproduct of not having one. Kinda reminds me of how Pokemon handles its gyms. I do wonder, in that sense, just how effective its freeform nature is when compared to Breath of the Wild. A Link Between Worlds, in many ways, is far more of a compromise than the newest 3D adventure. It builds its story, dungeons, overworld, and items in basically the exact same way, except it tweaks those past elements to fit in an open progression. Breath of the Wild completely uprooted the previous formula, leading to dungeons that were constructed very differently, a completely new way to traverse the world, and a new set of physics-based items that set it far apart from previous games, to the point where not all longtime fans were big on the changes. Personally, there are parts of both approaches that bother me a bit. A Link Between Worlds was very special at release, since it was really the only game since the first Zelda title that allowed for such a wide degree of freedom, and I'm willing to bet a lot of its acclaim was based on that long-held desire from fans to see a more open Zelda title. Nowadays, however, I think it's easier to see that without a more fundamental shift, you'll run into issues trying to balance difficulty in the same way, or create interesting dungeons. For as solid as the dungeons are in A Link Between Worlds, their locations are still signposted by the game, and at the end of the day, they're recycling the same bag of tricks that Zelda had been using for years up to that point. Meanwhile, Breath of the Wild was a game that went a little too far in some places. In abandoning so many Zelda traditions, there are only a handful of dungeons, and those dungeons pale in comparison to the best of series past, even though they try to feel unique in the freeform approach that's required to solve them. It has an incredible grasp on freeform puzzle solving with physics-based movement and multiple approaches to many of its problems. But, in an effort to fill out the world, a lot of those puzzles will be solved in very small increments, and you don't get that same feeling of conquering an incredibly tough series of puzzles all at once. One approach feels like a half step, and the other feels like a step too far. Both are admirable in the ways they attempted to switch up the formula, but I feel like a middle ground between them would be ideal. It is still refreshing to play A Link Between Worlds. For as rudimentary as it might feel, it does still feel like Zelda at its core, since it doesn't abandon absolutely everything that made the series great. In this sense, A Link Between Worlds is a solid Zelda title. I had a lot of fun with it, no doubt, but there's also a little more going on here, especially when compared to A Link to the Past. The original game is as iconic as it gets, frankly. It was an influential game, loved by Zelda fans the world over, and has been cemented as a true classic in the eyes of many. I have my own thoughts on that, which I've already expressed, and it's safe to say that not many people were fond of what I had to say. I think maybe by praising A Link Between Worlds, I can try to get across what I was saying in that video better. A Link to the Past was the progenitor of many ideas that the series would expand upon in future titles. It is a fairly standard Zelda adventure where you're trying to stop Ganon and hunting for magical MacGuffins across Hyrule. In my view, Ocarina of Time was an evolution of this, and so was Twilight Princess. Ocarina of Time, in my opinion, made each dungeon more memorable from a mechanical and visual standpoint. 3 dimensions gave Zelda a unique atmosphere that A Link to the Past never quite managed. It also told a more interesting story. It had themes of growing up, Ganon took over the world, and you had to stop him in the post-apocalypse. It wasn't without its own set of extensive problems, but the way I see it, it took what A Link to the Past established into the next level. Twilight Princess was another step in that line for me, telling a story that is entirely unique, with a set of dungeons drenched in visual variety and atmosphere, and delivering a true epic, the likes of which A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time could never quite reach. So, yeah, when I go back to play A Link to the Past, it does feel underwhelming. I recognize that Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess would not exist without A Link to the Past, but that doesn't make the game any more fun to play in a world where it has been outdone, in my opinion. Oh, isn't it fun that I have to keep qualifying every single statement I make with "in my opinion," so no one gets the wrong idea and thinks I'm trying to objectively quantify my opinions on a video game, which by their very nature are subjective? Sorry. I feel like the reason it didn't really go over well is because I was approaching the argument backwards, which people don't tend to do. Usually someone will look at a sequel and say this was better than the original. Which is basically what I was saying, except I approached it from the angle of this game isn't as special anymore because it has been outdone by its sequels. If that isn't an argument you're fond of, let's look at it like this. A Link Between Worlds sets out to do many of the same things A Link to the Past did, but in ways that I find to be more effective. The narrative is more intriguing, the game utilizes the dark and light world concept to get more mileage out of its world and characters, it has a set of visually interesting and mechanically rich dungeons, and has a lower focus on combat overall, likely due in part to its lower difficulty. A Link Between Worlds achieves a similar set of goals in a more successful fashion. Is that a fine thing to assert? Maybe not. Who knows? I really don't have any agenda towards A Link to the Past. I just think that it was such a solid springboard for the future of the series to jump off of that I have very little reason to travel back anymore. While I'm no longer fond of saying that remakes can replace an original, A Link Between Worlds is such an ambitious project that it almost transcends into the realm of a reimagining, one that I happen to prefer to that original, while also acknowledging that it wouldn't exist without the original. Acknowledging that it was important, but never lying to anyone, and saying that I enjoy playing a game that I really just don't have much passion for. I'm sorry if this video was shorter than average, but I've gotta be honest, I think I've just about exhausted this series. I know I haven't covered the original or Zelda 2, but I might be done talking about Zelda for a long while. Near the end of this thing, I kinda realized there are only so many ways I can talk about the same mechanics without sounding repetitive, and like I've done this 14 other times, because I kinda have. I dug as deep into this game as I could, but at the end of the day, many of the dungeons in this series are so similar that I'd just be repeating myself over and over if I went into them with even more depth. I've talked my ear off about every story beat, item, side quest, world layout, music, atmosphere. I've reached my critical limit with Zelda. I'm not sick of the series or anything, I'll still play the games readily. I'm just sick of writing about it right now. When Breath of the Wild 2 comes out, you know I'll be there to talk about it. But in the meantime, I'm just gonna let the series rest. I've discussed, in depth, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, Link's Awakening, the Oracle games, Minish Cap, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, and A Link Between Worlds. Plus, every single one of their remakes and little bits of Zelda 1 sprinkled in there for good measure. I feel like I have torn this series apart 6 ways to Sunday, and I certainly hope you enjoyed my perspective on a series I absolutely adore. This series is one of many highs and lows, with a metric fuck ton of ideas I can't even list in a single script. It has traveled to so many different places that almost any Zelda game could be someone's favorite, and for good reason. It is a series that defies imagination through every one of its iterations. At the end of the day, it's a series of legends that won't all appeal to everyone. I respect it so damn much for never taking the easy road and attempting to appeal to everyone. Wii Motion Plus swordplay to spice up combat? A story about impending death and the meaning of life? An epic adventure with a hint of melancholy? A seafaring pirate adventure? A time-traveling apocalypse? It's a series that I've never been disappointed by. Even if some titles didn't resonate as strongly with me, I know that there are millions of people across the globe who loved it, because there's a level of passion poured into these games that defy expectation. It's a truly wondrous series, one that never let me down, one that's been with me for my entire life, and one that made the success of this channel a possibility. I'll always be here to cover future games. Zelda will always be a part of this channel, of my DNA. But for now, rest easy, Link. You've earned it.